Walk into any dispensary today and look at what's actually sitting in the jars. Dense, chunky, frosty buds that look like little rocks rolled in sugar. That's just what weed looks like now. But it wasn't always like that. Go back 60 years, and almost every cannabis plant on Earth was tall, stringy, and airy, and took half a year just to finish growing. Then one day, a plant came along called Afghani. It came down out of the mountains of Afghanistan and rewired the entire cannabis industry. And today, almost every single strain sitting on a shelf has a piece of it hiding inside. This is the story of Afghani. So the first thing you've got to understand is that nobody bred Afghani in a lab. It's a landrace, which just means it's a plant that nature and local farmers built together over a very long time in one specific place. The process goes like this. Wild cannabis grows in one area for hundreds and hundreds of years, and two things start happening at the same time. First, nature does its own filtering. Any plant that can't handle that specific climate just dies off before it ever makes seeds, and the survivors get passed down. Secondly, the farmers living there are picking their favorites every single season. Do that over and over for centuries, and the plant slowly becomes a perfect match for that specific place on Earth. And what makes these special are the fact that you can't get them anywhere else, because nowhere else has that combination of dirt, sun, altitude, and weather. And for Afghani, that place is the Hindu Kush. It's this enormous mountain range that runs right through the heart of Afghanistan and pushes out into Pakistan and northern India. And it's not one single environment either. It's hundreds of steep, cut-off valleys. And back then, a lot of them were so isolated from each other that the people in one valley might be growing something noticeably different from the people 2 valleys over. So you didn't get one Afghani. You got dozens of local versions, each one quietly perfected by the families who lived there. Now I want you to picture what that place is actually like, because the environment is the entire reason this plant turned out the way it did. The Hindu Kush is brutal. You've got blazing hot summers, and then freezing winters that show up early and hit hard. The soil is dry and rough. The altitude is high, so the sun comes down with insane intensity, and the wind tears through those valleys constantly. So a plant growing up there wasn't just growing, it was fighting to stay alive. And you can see that fight in the shape of the plant. Instead of growing tall and stretched out, it grew short, thick, and bushy like a little Christmas tree with barely any space between the branches. Its leaves came out wide and dark green, so it could soak up as much of that mountain sun as possible. And most importantly, it learned to finish fast, wrapping up its whole flowering cycle in about 7 to 9 weeks, because winter was coming and it didn't have time to waste. On top of all that, it caked itself in resin, this thick layer of sticky trichomes, which is basically the plant's natural sunscreen and antifreeze all in one. That resin protected it from the harsh sun, the cold, and the dry wind. And when the temperature really dropped, it would even turn purple. Different valleys and different towns each ended up with their own version of it. The city of Mazar-i-Sharif up in the north became famous for its own line. So did the region around Kandahar, down south. Same plant family, but every area had its own local flavor of it that they'd been perfecting for generations. Now this plant goes back further than most people realize. Back in 1924, a Russian botanist named Nikolai Vavilov led an expedition through Afghanistan, documenting the crops there, and he wrote about the local hashish plants he found. He published all of it in a book in 1929, and he got a gold medal from the Russian Geographic Society for the work. Then, decades later, in 1971, a Harvard researcher named Richard Schultes traveled out there too. And it wasn't until around 1974 that the West finally published a proper scientific description of this broad-leafed Afghan plant as its own distinct thing. So, scientists were basically playing catch-up to something Afghan farmers had known about forever. And the archaeology goes back way further than that. Because up in the Pamir Mountains, right in that same part of the world, researchers found an ancient burial site from around 2,500 years ago, where people were burning high-potency cannabis in little braziers during funeral ceremonies. And right there is the earliest hard scientific proof we have of humans deliberately smoking cannabis to get high. Now, I do want to be honest with you about one thing, because you'll hear people say cannabis was born in Afghanistan. And the truth is a little more complicated. A big genetic study published in 2021 traced the plant's original domestication back about 12,000 years to East Asia, not Afghanistan. So, Afghanistan probably isn't the literal birthplace of the whole species. But what it absolutely is the home of this specific broad-leafed hash plant, the one that changed everything. So don't call it the birthplace of weed. Call it the birthplace of the plant that built modern weed. And that brings us to the real reason Afghani exists in the form it does, because these plants were never bred to be smoked as flower. They were bred to make hashish. Afghanistan has one of the oldest continuous hash cultures on the planet, going back at least to the medieval period, when Sufi scholars in the region were already writing about it. And the way they made it is beautifully simple. They'd let the plants dry out completely, then shake and beat them over fine screens. All that dried resin would crumble off and fall through as a fine powder they call garda. Then they'd warm it up, press it, and knead it by hand into those dense, dark, soft blocks the world knows as Afghan black hash. There's also a hand-rubbing technique, where fresh resin gets worked off the living plant directly between the palms, which in South Asian and Central Asian traditions goes by the name charas. The stuff coming out of the north, around Mazar-e-Sharif and Balkh province, got a legendary reputation. People called it the milk of Mazar. Real Afghan hash is famous for being soft and oily and stretchy, with this spicy, musky, earthy smell. And that hash tradition explains something important about the plant. Because when you're sieving resin off a whole field of plants and mixing it all together, you're not really hunting for one single super potent plant the way modern breeders do. You're farming for the total amount of resin. So there was never much pressure to select for one individual monster plant, which is exactly why real Landrace Afghani varies so much, with some plants leaning heavy on THC and others carrying a lot of CBD, averaging out somewhere around an even split between the two. That's very different from modern weed, which has been pushed hard in one direction for decades. So how did a plant from the mountains of Afghanistan end up in California? Well, that comes down to a road. Starting in the mid-1950s and running all the way through the 70s, there was this overland route across the world called the Hippie Trail. Young Western travelers would set off from Europe and work their way through Turkey, then Iran, then straight through Afghanistan, and on into Pakistan, India, and Nepal. And Afghanistan was one of the biggest stops on the whole route. Travelers hung out on Chicken Street in Kabul, passed through Herat and Kandahar, and smoked the best hash they'd ever had in their lives. And when they went home, some of them brought hash back with them, hidden in things like tins of jam. But way more importantly, some of them brought seeds. That whole trail died in 1979, when the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan slammed the road shut for good. But by then, the seeds were already out. And once those seeds hit America, everything changed. Researchers who studied this later figured there were at least several dozen separate times that Afghan and Pakistani seeds got carried into North America through the mid to late 70s. The earliest famous ones were called Afghani Number One, Mazar-e-Sharif, and Hindu Kush. And they landed in exactly the right places, out in California, Oregon, and the Pacific Northwest, right where American growers were trying to figure out how to grow their own weed. And you've got to understand why those growers lost their minds over this plant. Because at the time, American weed came from tall tropical sativas out of Colombia, Mexico, Panama, and Thailand. Those plants are beautiful, but they were a nightmare to actually grow up north. They'd stretch way too tall, and they'd take 12, 14, sometimes 16 weeks or more to finish flowering. So by the time they were ready, the cold and the rain had already ruined them. But then one day Afghani showed up. It's short, so you can hide it or fit it under lights indoors. It finishes in about 8 weeks. It yields heavy, it handles cold, and it's dripping in resin. So growers started crossing it into those tall tropical plants, and suddenly a plant that used to take 4 months finished in about 8 to 10 weeks and got shorter, got frostier, and yielded more. So just like that, weed could be grown places it had never survived before. Indoors, under lights, out in a backyard, all the way up through the cold parts of North America and Europe. The trade-off came with it, though. Afghani came from air so dry that mold and mildew couldn't get a foothold, so it never needed a defense against them and never built one. So when breeders crossed it into everything, they crossed that weakness in too. Now, let's talk about the actual people who did this, because this story has real names attached to it. One of the first documented is Mel Frank, who co-wrote the Marijuana Grower's Guide, one of the most famous growing books of that era. Around 1978, he got his hands on Afghani Number One and started selecting it for potency and early flowering. Then there's the man who might be the single most important figure here, a California breeder named David Watson, who most people know as Sam the Skunkman. Working out of Santa Cruz with a collective called Sacred Seeds, Watson crossed Afghani with Colombian gold, and then crossed that into Acapulco gold. Out of that came Skunk Number One. Now Skunk Number One mattered for a reason people don't always catch. It was one of the first genuinely stable hybrids ever made, which means the seeds actually grew consistent every single time, instead of giving you a different plant out of every seed in the pack. And Watson didn't do it by himself. A researcher named Robert Clark worked alongside him, and the two later founded a company called Hortifarm and wrote some of the most important scientific work on cannabis ever published. As for the Afghani itself, Watson has said flat out that Mel Frank handed it to him. And by 1981, Sacred Seeds had Skunk listed in a catalog and was selling it. But remember, all of this was completely illegal in America, and eventually law enforcement came through the door and shut the whole operation down. So Watson got out of the country, and he went to Amsterdam because the Netherlands was the one place in the world where you could work with this plant openly without the police kicking your door in. He took his life's work with him, a box holding something like 250,000 seeds, including Skunk Number One, Original Haze, and Afghani Number One. And that single box is basically what founded the modern Dutch cannabis industry. And the reason that box mattered so much is that somebody was already over there waiting for it. His name was Neville Schoenmakers, and in 1984, he started a company called the Seed Bank. Now Neville did something nobody had ever done before, which is that he advertised cannabis seeds openly and directly to the public, running ads right in the pages of High Times magazine. And he was chasing the exact same problem everybody else was. Tropical sativas grew terribly in the cold, gray Dutch weather, so he bought genetics off Watson, including Skunk Number One, Original Haze, Hindu Kush, and Afghani Number One, and he got to work crossing those tropical plants with Afghan Indicas until he had something that would actually finish in Europe and under lights. He also got his hands on Northern Lights, a heavily Afghani line out of the Pacific Northwest, and crossing that with haze gave him one of the most award-winning plants in the history of weed. High Times crowned him the king of cannabis in 1985. Then the American government came after him. He got indicted in the States and arrested in Australia in 1990, though the charges eventually fell apart and the Dutch refused to hand him over. His genetics ended up getting bought by a Dutch businessman named Ben Dronkers, the founder of Sensi Seeds, which grew into one of the biggest and most influential seed banks on the planet. And Sensi is a huge part of how those Afghan genetics ended up spread across Europe and the rest of the world. Now, I do have to be straight with you about the myths in this story, because there are a few. You'll hear people say, Afghani was heroically smuggled out right before the Soviets invaded. That's basically stoner lore, not documented history. You'll also see single hero stories claiming one specific guy invented skunk back in 1969, or that returning Vietnam veterans brought all these seeds home. Those are guesses too. The honest version is that it wasn't one dramatic moment or one legendary person. It was a loose, scattered network of travelers, collectors, and growers across California, Oregon, and the Pacific Northwest, quietly bringing Afghan seeds home throughout the mid to late 70s. And behind all of them were centuries of Afghan farmers whose names nobody will ever know. But what came out of all that is what people call the Indica Revolution. Through the late 70s and into the 80s, those imported tropical sativas got pushed almost completely off the market, replaced by stable, potent, fast, compact hybrids. And the founding names of that era all trace right back to Afghani. Skunk Number One, Northern Lights, Hindu Kush, Master Kush, Afghan Kush, and Super Skunk, which is just Skunk Number One bred back into Afghani to make it even stronger. And once you know what to look for, you start seeing Afghani everywhere in modern weed. The entire Kush family is named after the Hindu Kush mountains. OG Kush, the plant that basically anchors the whole West Coast, carries Afghan heritage through Hindu Kush, and its genetic fingerprint runs straight through to gelato, then cookies, then runts, and from there into hundreds of the strains sitting on shelves right now. Now, I'll be honest, OG Kush's exact family tree is famously murky, and nobody can fully prove it, but its flavor and its effects point right back at those Afghan varieties. Bubba Kush showed up in the late 90s, tied to a guy named Matt Berger, built from a Northern Lights type cutting crossed into OG Kush. Its genetics were never officially documented either, but that short, stocky build and that hash-forward taste are Afghani fingerprints. Northern Lights, which is mostly Afghani with a little Thai in it, went on to father Super Silver Haze, Shiva Skunk, and Jack Harrer. But on top of all that, even Granddaddy Purple has Afghan genetics running through it. Now, there's one more here that I have to mention, and I love the story behind it, because the breeder did it backwards on purpose. DJ Short created Blueberry in the late 70s and 80s, and he built it by taking a male Afghani plant, only one generation removed from Afghanistan itself, and using it to pollinate Thai sativa mothers. Now, most breeders at the time were doing the opposite, using Afghani females as the base. But Short actually preferred the sativa smoke, so he used the Afghani purely as the tool to add resin, structure, and that fast finish, while keeping the sativa character he loved. And it worked. Blueberry took Best Indica at the High Times Cannabis Cup in the year 2000, and it went on to spawn Blue Dream and that whole Blue family. The researchers who study this stuff put it about as bluntly as it can be put. Basically, every modern drug variety of cannabis is a hybrid between the old narrow-leafed tropical sativas and this Afghan broad-leafed plant. That's the whole modern gene pool right there. Two family lines that got married in the 1970s And everything you smoke today is a descendant of that marriage. Now, as for Afghani itself, the pure landrace, it smokes exactly like you'd expect from a plant bred for hash. It's a heavy, classic indica. It's deeply relaxing and sedating. It's all in the body, and it will absolutely glue you to the couch. It's the kind of thing people reach for at night, for sleep, for pain, and for stress. The smell is earthy and sweet and spicy, with an incense quality and a distinct hash note running through it. Somebody once described it as hash dipped in pine oil, which is about perfect. Now all of that smell comes from the terpenes, which are basically the aromatic oils the plant produces. In Afghani, the ones running the show are myrcene and caryophyllene, with limonene and pinene underneath them. And as for the look, the buds are dense, dark, and completely caked in resin. Now on strength, I'll give it to you straight. True landrace Afghani is moderate by today's standards, usually landing somewhere in the high teens to low 20s for THC, and often carrying real CBD alongside it, which most modern hybrids don't. This was never a plant chasing a big number on a label. It was a plant built to produce the best resin on Earth. So what happened to Afghani back home? The short answer is that it's been a brutal 100 years. Through most of the last century, under King Zahir Shah, who sat on the throne from 1933 to 1973, this was a tolerated crop and at times an encouraged one. But sadly, hashish got restricted in 1957 under pressure from the United States. But that was mostly on paper, and the trade rolled on anyways. But then came 1973. With the American war on drugs ramping up hard, the king put out a real ban with about $47 million of American funding behind it, and troops went out and tore up farms, and he was overthrown before the year was out. Then on top of that, the Soviets invaded in 1979, and much of the growing and hash making shifted over the border into Pakistan's tribal areas. After that, it was decades of war, Taliban rule, opium poppies competing for the same land, and eradication campaign after eradication campaign. And through all of that, this plant still refused to quit. In 2010, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, published its first comprehensive survey of Afghan cannabis, and it named Afghanistan the largest hashish producer in the entire world, somewhere between 1,500 and 3,500 tons a year. They found it growing in 17 of the country's 34 provinces. And the yields were staggering, about 145 kilograms of hash per hectare, compared to around 40 kilograms per hectare in Morocco. That's how good the plant and the farmers are. But the biggest threat came recently. In March of 2023, the Taliban's supreme leader issued a decree banning cannabis cultivation across the entire country, ordering fields destroyed and violators punished. It followed an earlier decree banning all narcotics. So, the tradition that fed the whole world's hash supply for centuries is now under more pressure than it has ever been. Which is exactly why preservation matters so much now. Because Afghanistan was so isolated for so long, a lot of those land races stayed remarkably pure without getting crossed into everything else. Today, there are seed banks and landrace hunters whose entire mission is keeping those genetics alive, offering old Afghan lines including bulky and heirloom stock saved from the original Amsterdam days, some of it tracing back to the very genetics that passed through sacred seeds and sensi seeds. So yes, real Afghani genetics do still exist in those collections, in old seed stock, and with Afghan farmers who still save their own seeds. It is just fragile. And there is a real irony in how this all ended up. Because right now, the biggest thing in high-end weed is solventless hash and rosin, which is people pressing pure resin out of the plant and smoking that instead of flower, which is basically the exact thing Afghan farmers have been doing by hand for hundreds of years. The whole industry spent 50 years chasing bigger THC numbers on flower, and now the most expensive product on the shelf is a hash concentrate. So the plant that got built for resin, in a place with no labs and no lights and no marketing, turned out to be right the whole time. So at the end of the day, Afghani might be the most important plant in the entire history of weed, and it barely gets talked about. It did not get a hit song or a rapper's cosign. It just came down out of a mountain range, hidden in the pockets of travelers, and quietly got crossed into everything. It made growing indoors possible. It made growing up north possible. It gave the world skunk, northern lights, and the whole Kush family. And every dense, frosty, fast-finishing nug you have ever bought owes something to a plant that Afghan farmers spent centuries perfecting for hash.